Sadly, it couldn't be more timely. And your book, I must say, is going to be very, very timely. From your perspective, because you've worked in the private sector and you've also worked in government, obviously, what is a sensible way to approach this series of problems involving tech and social media?
You know, David, it is a tragedy what happened in New Zealand, and then how social media becomes a vehicle to spread it. I mean, I think what we need to come to grips with is that clearly there are First Amendment rights and there are rights of speakers, but we need to figure out just where do you draw the line? What's the equivalent to shouting fire in the crowded theater in the internet age? And I think that goes back to one of the themes that I develop in From Gutenberg to Google, which is that when we moved from agrarian mercantilism to industrial capitalism in the middle of the 19th century, all of the old rules didn't work anymore. And so in the late 19th and early 20th century, we had to establish the rules, we being the government, the people, had to establish rules that reflected the new realities. And so the things that you and I take for granted, antitrust, consumer protection, worker protection, this sort of thing that got put in place to establish rules for industrial capitalism. Now, we are in the era of internet capitalism, and some of these old rules don't work anymore. And so what we need is a healthy debate, dialogue, and decisions on the establishment of new rules that reflect our new realities. And one of those will be what happens in an environment, a news environment, if you will, where there are no editors exercising editorial judgment. What do we substitute for that? How do we deal with that?
Right, and what is the model at this point? I frankly don't know, because before we had the internet and social media, you sort of had two models. One was broadcasters and publishers, and they're responsible for what they put on the airwaves or what they put in their newspapers or in their magazines, no question about it. And you had the telephone company. They were not responsible if two people decided to use a private telephone to do something illegal. Does either of those models apply to a Facebook or a Twitter? Or do we have to have yet another model? How responsible are they? Because thus far, as I understand it, the tech companies are saying, wait a second, we're more like a telephone company. We have no responsibility for what goes up on our sites.
Well, I think that we've got to start with the assumption that despite the fact that Facebook says we're just a tech company, they're making editorial decisions the same way the Washington Post or the New York Times makes editorial decisions. And I also believe that if we can, so I have proposed, for instance, what I call public interest APIs, application programming interfaces, how software talks to software. That the black box that is the algorithm that makes Facebook's editorial decisions is fed by a stream of data coming in and sends a stream of data coming out that we don't know what's in either of those. If there was the ability for third parties to interface with that data, to understand what's coming in and what's going out, then you create the potential for some kind of independent oversight, review, or at least understanding what's going on.
And how much of the problem is what these companies are doing or facilitating to be done, and how much of it is their size? Because we have an Elizabeth Warren now coming forward with what I take to be a serious proposal to say the problem is the size, the scope of these companies. We need to break them up. We have to keep them smaller. And so, to put it simply, it's sort of a Glass-Steagall sort of approach, where these companies such as a Facebook or an Amazon, a Google, have to separate out their basic platform from their advertising activities, their other sorts of activities. Does that approach make sense to you?
So, first of all, clearly we need to have policies that promote competition. And there are three ways you can do that. One, you can break up the companies like has been proposed. The difficulty with that is that lawsuit tends to take a long time, 6 to 10 years. Secondly, we need to have better antitrust review of mergers so we don't get deeper into this hole. And third, we need to have regulation that is pro-competition in its nature. Specifically with regard to the big tech companies, though, I think there's a question between break up and break out. And what do I mean by that? The power that these companies get in the marketplace comes from the fact that they take your and my personal information and they turn it into their corporate asset and hoard it, and then turn around and allow access to it for, monopoly rents. That asset is the currency of the 21st century. We need to provide interconnection into those assets. Think for a minute. Mark Zuckerberg, in the early days of Facebook, took on MySpace and beat him in a good, old-fashioned, my product is better kind of competition. If you or I today said, hey, I've got a new Facebook, let's bring it out, there's no way we could compete, because Facebook has 2.25 billion subscribers and all of the data that relates to them, and it's that data that they turn around and monetize, and a new competitor has no chance to get that hoard of data. So how do we provide interconnection for competitors into that data so that we can have innovation, so that we can have marketplace competition? And so there are choices, and people will begin making editorial decisions in the process.
So, Tom, let me ask you a process question. You know the federal government well. Who within the federal government understands this enough, has the expertise to be able to do something? There's a lot of frustration. You see it on Capitol Hill, you see it in some administrative agencies and things. It's pretty complicated. It's new for a lot of us. This is new stuff. Where does that reside? Do we have the repository of expertise to sort these very difficult technical and moral and legal questions out?
It's a great question, David. We have a representative government, and like their constituents, our representatives are just beginning to come to speed on what the implications are and what the problems are. And the tech companies have for years been selling the line that this is magic. Don't touch it. You may break the magic. And they've been making the rules. I think we've now all learned that there is some significant downside to this magic and to allowing these companies to make their own rules. And somebody needs to step in. And it's what we've done historically. Again, go back to the book From Gutenberg to Google for a second. What we have always done in times of technological revolution is that the pioneers make the rules until those rules begin to infringe on the rights of the public and the public interest, and then the government steps up. And I think that's the point we're at now. Now, your question as to whether or not it's the FCC or the FTC or a new digital agency, I think we have to work our way through that, but we ought to be looking in terms of saying, how do we plan for the reality that we have today, not the reality that existed, for instance, in my case, at the FCC in 1934.